I've been a journalist most of my career. I started out working for the great radical independent journalist I.F. Stone as his only staff. I worked for Pacifica Radio, I worked for the Village Voice, then I went on to the Washington Post during the Watergate era. I've been editor of a couple of magazines, including working papers for New Society. I'm currently co-editor of the American Prospect. And in between, I was the chief investigator of the Senate Banking Committee, where I really learned about finance. So I would say throughout this period, I've hung on to the sense that where my politics is at the left edge of the possible, as Mike Harrington used to say. I'm much more comfortable thinking of myself as being on the edge of the political mainstream, trying to push and prod the political mainstream, rather than thinking that I'm outside the mainstream, somehow going to make a difference in my own little world with people who agree with me. I guess I got my politics in a number of ways. My parents were not especially political, although they were New Deal Democrats, as almost everybody was in that era. But I grew up in a lower middle class family. I was born in New York. I went to Oberlin College, where I think the whole spirit of the place is one of constructive radicalism. That influenced me tremendously. And I keep waiting for us to elect a Democratic president who understands that Roosevelt was as popular as he was because he delivered for people, not because he got in bed with Wall Street. On the contrary, he reined in Wall Street because that was necessary to get the rest of the economy back on track. We didn't get that with Carter. We didn't get that with Clinton. We started to get it with LBJ. He ruined it all in the jungles of Vietnam. The really interesting question for me, and I've now written 2 books on this subject, is whether Obama is going to seize the moment that history has handed him. In late 2006 and early 2007, in my role as co-editor of the American Prospect, after Obama declared, I got extremely interested in who this guy was. And I think any of us who read his first book, Dreams from My Father, had to conclude that this was a very, very interesting, unusual politician. Now, at the time, he was slightly to the right of the other leading Democrats who were in the field. Edwards certainly was more progressive on economic issues. Hillary was a bit better on some issues. But Obama, to me anyway, and I think to a lot of other people, he seemed to be the guy who possibly had a spark of greatness in him, who was capable of real growth in office and maybe who could rise to a moment of crisis and perhaps be a transformative president. And that's how Obama's Challenge, my first book for Chelsea Green, my first book on Obama, came about. And the publisher and I decided that we'd take a risk. We would publish the book before the election results were known, and we'd either have a bestseller or a bonfire. And Obama got lucky, we got lucky, maybe the American people got lucky, because I think by the time we published that in August of '08, it was clear that the financial crisis was going to be very serious, and it was clear that Obama was very likely to be elected president because the voters were inclined to throw the rascals out. So that brings me to the question of how he's doing. In Obama's Challenge, the book, I wrote that he would either be a great president or a failed president. He would either be the next Roosevelt or he would be the next Hoover, because the crisis was so severe and the potential of really transforming assumptions about what we need to do for the economy was so profound that he would either catch the wave and surf the wave, or the wave would sink him. And so I also pointed out, continuing the ocean metaphor, that there was a huge undertow of bad advice. The deficit is more important than the recovery, and restoring confidence on Wall Street is more important than restraining the banks. And unfortunately, Obama, who could have made a clean break with the old regime, hired the old regime. He hired Tim Geithner to be Treasury Secretary. Geithner had been president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. As such, he had been Bernanke's right-hand man. He reappointed Bernanke. He brought in Larry Summers, who had been Clinton's Treasury Secretary. And the whole orgy of deregulation did not begin under George W. Bush. It began under Clinton, and Summers and Bob Rubin, Summers' mentor, were the chief architects of this. So if you compare this with Roosevelt, this was like Roosevelt hiring Hoover's team. Inconceivable. I I warned about the risks of this in Obama's challenge. And as I mentioned, the book came out just before the election. Then in the new book, A Presidency in Peril, I pick up the story of Obama's first year, what he did what he did, why he did not turn out to be Roosevelt, and where we think his opportunities lie as we go forward from here. A lot of people argued that you had to hire folks who knew what they were doing, who were experienced, and you had to restore confidence. Now, there are two big things wrong with that premise. First of all, there are a lot of people who are equally knowledgeable who just didn't have the same viewpoint or the same strategy that Summers and Geithner and Bernanke had. Joe Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner, former chief economist of the World Bank, former head of Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, had a completely different view of what needed to be done in the crisis. It's a view that I happen to share. Simon Johnson, the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, shares that view. Jamie Galbraith, Robert Reich, a number of other people who are very knowledgeable about financial markets. Sheila Bair, the head of the FDIC, Elizabeth Warren, the head of the Congressional Oversight Panel, and I all have a completely different view. And I think, to sum up, the difference between the Summers, Geithner, Bernanke view and the view of the critics is whether you needed to prop up failed banks, zombie banks, banks that were insolvent in everything but name, or whether you needed to do what they call a resolution, do an honest accounting of just how bad the bank's balance sheets are, take them over, fire the scoundrels who created the mess, and then decide how to break them up, how much subsidy you need to put in order to get them back on their feet, and open them back up again in a reorganized fashion with new management. Now, the Summers-Geithner view was this would be too destabilizing. Our view was, no, let's clean the thing up and get on with it. And I think the problem with the policy that they pursued is that you have the illusion of health. It's like giving a transfusion to somebody who's dying. They look healthy for the moment, but all you're doing is prolonging the agony. And as a result of failing to clean up the financial system properly, we are having not a Great Depression, but we're having a great stagnation. We're having a prolonged period where homeowners and small businesses and ordinary corporate borrowers can't get credit because everything has to go to the health of the balance sheet of the banks first. So they help the wrong end of the telescope. They help prop up Wall Street, and now Main Street is lagging very, very far behind. This was not the result of a failure of available talent. And the idea of shoring up confidence in a system that was a corrupt system was not a good thing to do. So the process of digging out from the hole that we're in is going to be much more protracted as a result of the way they did it. And then you ask the question, well, why did Obama do this? And I think there are several answers to that, which I get into in great detail in Obama's challenge. One was that economics was not his personal strong suit. If you look at his history, this is a man who cares about human rights, civil rights, he cares about foreign policy. Economics is not the subject that he knows best. Secondly, he raised a ton of money on Wall Street. Wall Street was his biggest single contributor. He was not inclined to be the kind of radical president that Roosevelt was in 1933. So he hired the old guard. And then the old guard reinforced his predisposition to look for common ground with the Republicans, to look for common ground with Wall Street. Paul Volcker, former chairman of the Federal Reserve, not much beloved by liberals because he tried to break the back of inflation by putting interest rates through the roof in the early 80s, causing high unemployment. Liberals have never liked Paul Volcker. On the other hand, Paul Volcker is very skeptical of deregulation. He was the critic of repealing all the regulations from the 30s because he knew financial markets so well that he knew that this was an invitation to mischief. Well, right now, things are so center right that the radical in the room is Paul Volcker. And Summers and Geithner have done everything they can to fence him out, not have him exercise the influence that he should be exercising. And it just tells you how far we are from the kind of policies that we need. When Obama was elected, he had several big challenges. One was to get the financial system back to health, but not the financial system as it existed in 2007 and 2008, when it crashed, a new reformed financial system. And he needed to combine assistance to the banks with radical reform of the banks. Instead of using the leverage that he had at a moment when he was pumping $700 billion of taxpayer money into the banking system to extract reform in return, reform came second, and so the moment was lost. The second thing Obama really needed to do big time was mortgage relief. We're on track to have 10 million foreclosures during Obama's term. And when you have homeowners losing their homes, that drags down the value of properties around them. It drags down the value of real estate all across the country. And it's like saying that my neighbor's house is on fire. Should I pay my share of putting the fire out? Well, you know that if you don't do that, the fire is going to spread to your house. But in the case of mortgage relief, again, they've put the needs of the banks first. They're starting to talk about a stronger program, but they're still not willing to have the kind of direct government refinancing program that Roosevelt had. They're talking about just more relief as extended by the banks. In the health care bill, there was a big fight about the so-called public option. Well, sometimes public options are better than private options. We just saw this when the Democrats finally mustered the nerve to get rid of the private student loan program, which was just a big subsidy for banks, and have a direct student loan program from the government. And the savings are sufficient to increase Pell Grants. So there's a win-win, and there's a nice demonstration that sometimes public options are better than private options. The same thing holds true of mortgage refinancing. In the 1930s, when you had one homeowner in 5 underwater, the government, through Roosevelt, created something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They used the Treasury's own ability to borrow at very low interest rates to then give homeowners very low interest rate mortgages. We need something like that today. So he needed to clean up the banks. He needed to extend mortgage relief. He needed a much bigger jobs program than the jobs program we've had so far. And he needed fiscal relief to states and local governments. The federal stimulus is $787 billion spent out over 4 years. During the same 4 years, state and local governments are out about $600 billion. So if you take $600 billion away with one hand, and then you put in $787 billion with the other hand, that's a very paltry stimulus. And yet the deficit hawks have had so much influence on this administration that even now, with unemployment still close to 10%, with the economy having lost 11 million jobs, they're not willing to put forward a robust jobs program. I mean, there was a bill signing in late March at the White House. They had a Rose Garden ceremony for a little paltry $15 billion bill that was mostly tax credits. I wondered why the roses didn't wilt. So if this man is going to be the great president that a lot of people who voted for him in November of '08 felt that he could be, we saw the glimmer of this when he finally decided to get angry and get tough with the Republicans on health care. But if he's going to realize the promise of his presidency and the moment and the recovery that the economy needs, he's got to deliver stronger medicine. He's got to be a more assertive leader. What's interesting about health care reform is that it took the loss of Ted Kennedy's Senate seat and the victory of Republican Scott Brown on January 19th, 364 days into Obama's presidency, before this president got a wake-up call. And then if you look at what happened between January 19th and the end of March, when they finally got the bill through, for the first few weeks they dithered. Rahm Emanuel was talking about, well, let's just make a deal with the Republicans, see what they can support, have a little mini bill. Thank God Obama rejected that counsel. Then he goes to the Republican caucus meeting in Baltimore and searches for common ground, says, I'm not an ideologue, I'm not. To which my response was, well, you're not? Why bother? I mean, ideology is not a bad word. The right wing has one set of ideological beliefs. The government can't do anything right. The market can't do anything wrong. People get what they deserve. progressives like me and many of my readers, many of Chelsea Green's readers, have a different ideology. History shows that markets mess things up a lot of the time, and people suffer privations that they don't deserve. Obama finally gets it that the Republicans are not going to cut him any slack. They're totally out to destroy him. And given that fact, there's nothing wrong with doing this as a Democrats-only bill. And funny thing, he gets points for leadership. His ratings actually go up. The approval rating for the health plan goes up. Now, the health plan, it's not my plan. I would have preferred national health insurance. But at least it shows that when you have some leadership and you have some organizing to back the leadership up, there was a very good national coalition of progressive groups called HCAN, Healthcare Action. And when you have that, the right wing doesn't turn out to be so powerful. So the question is whether Obama is going to build on this, whether grassroots organizing is going to be energized. And of course, if you look at Roosevelt, you look at Lincoln, you look at LBJ during the Civil Rights era, it took organizing in the country for Roosevelt to become Roosevelt. It took the industrial labor movement. It took Dr. King and the heroism of the Civil Rights movement before Johnson rose to the occasion. It took the abolitionists before Lincoln, whose original goal was to preserve the Union, decided to free the slaves. And what's interesting, writing this book a little more than a year into Obama's presidency, is that the jury is still out. And I close the book on the note that whether he rises to the occasion is partly a test of his character, but it's partly a test of our character. If we, in the progressive community, allow all the activism in the streets to be the Tea Party people, then shame on us. And maybe the victory on health care, even though it's not the bill I would have proposed, and even though I supported it only because I think having a loss would have energized the Republicans. But if we don't use this moment to energize ourselves, then shame on us. People are very anxious. People are uneasy. And what you have in the Tea Party movement and the organized far right is a combination of right-wing talk radio and Fox News and Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh and all that, giving people the talking points and the message. You have some folks who are genuinely anxious and somewhat confused about who to blame. And then you have a lot of this orchestrated by the National Republican Party and by groups like Freedom Works, which are corporate funded, headed by Dick Armey, the former Republican Majority Leader of the House, hardly a grassroots populist. It's a complicated brew. I mean, if you go back to Nazi Germany, it was a complicated brew of corporations who found it expedient to back Hitler and ordinary people who were terrified because of the economic distress of the 1920s. But I think history shows that when progressives fail to rise to the moment, you create an opening for right-wing populism. And this is a mix of hardcore right-wing ideologues and ordinary frightened people and Republican and Wall Street elites paying the cost. Now, again, there is certainly an opportunity for progressive Democrats and progressives generally to regain control of the narrative and to explain that the problem here is Wall Street having gone nuts for 30 years, not death squads taking out grandma. And again, Obama is starting to rise to the occasion, but it's the first step in a very long journey. And if you compare this with Roosevelt, which I do at various points in the book, A Presidency in Peril, and you ask the question, why in the 1930s, when the far right got so much traction in so many countries, did it get so little traction in the U.S.? I mean, there were figures of the far right, Father Coughlin, and Lindbergh became a kind of a right-wing nut after he stopped being an aviator. So this stuff was around, Gerald L.K. Smith. But every time the far right tried to enlist the white working class, they would run into somebody who loved Roosevelt, because Roosevelt delivered for working people. And so the far right did not get much traction. Obama yet has not delivered enough for ordinary working people. That's why there was a 48-point swing in Massachusetts among white working class voters. who had voted with great hopes for Obama, and a year later things are worse, and so they vote for Scott Brown, who stood for nothing in particular except for the fact that he was anti-Obama. So there's always this danger that in periods of economic stress, there's a far-right narrative that blames it on government and blames it on foreigners and blames it on immigrants and to some extent blames it on Wall Street. Now, I would say going forward, you have financial reform on the table. That's going to be a lot harder for Republicans to vote against because banks are so unpopular. Here, the obstacle that stands in the way, stands between us and reform, is not so much Republican obstructionism, it's whether Democrats show some nerve. It's whether Democrats are willing to stand up to Wall Street. It's much harder for Republicans to vote in favor of Wall Street. Wall Street is monumentally unpopular. And Senator Corker of Tennessee, a member of the Banking Committee who Senator Dodd, the chairman, was trying to negotiate a bipartisan deal with, was saying this isn't like health care. There really ought to be some common ground here. Well, another way of saying that is the Democrats have a lot more leverage to embarrass Republicans and force Republicans to take unpopular votes. But the Democrats first need to stand up to Wall Street and give us much stronger reform legislation than they've given us. A Democrat running for re-election in November 2010 is going to be able to say, look, we delivered this. It's not perfect. It's a first step, but it helps a lot of people, and the Republicans were just obstructionists. So the question really for me, and it's intriguing, having tasted victory, having tasted the fruits of being a real leader and a real partisan, is he going to build on this, or is he going to go back to his default setting of looking for more areas of common ground with the Republicans? That's the really interesting question going forward. And I think the success of his presidency will stand or fall on whether he can build on the kind of leadership that he finally showed in the ninth inning of the health fight, or whether this was a one-off. And now he's got to think much, much bigger on jobs. The kind of money he spent on jobs, a third of it through tax credits, is just not sufficient to solve the unemployment crisis. We've lost 11 million jobs since this started. And that means that to get back to the unemployment rate before this recession began, you're going to need to create 500,000 jobs every month for several years, and we're still in a position of losing net jobs. We're not even gaining jobs. The unemployment rate 17 or 18% if you count people who want full-time work and have to settle for part-time work. And the president's own figures show the unemployment rate at 8% in 2014. So what kind of a recovery is that? I mean, if you look at the 1930s, gross domestic product was growing, but the unemployment rate was still in double digits right up until the beginning of World War II. So he's got to do better on jobs. He's got to do better on mortgage relief. He's got to do better on turning the banks to a constructive social purpose. He's got to do better on helping the states. And you look around, there are so many public needs that are not being met. He's got to think bigger. I'll give you one. I talk about this in the book Presidency and Peril. The completion rate at community colleges of people who enroll in two-year degrees or certificate programs, 35% get a degree within 6 years. Now, that's not because they're stupid or because they're not motivated. It's because most of them are working two jobs, and most of them have families. They're not your typical 18-year-old freshman from an affluent family. The typical community college student is in his or her 30s or 40s and trying to go back and get a credential. Why not recognize that reality, come up with, I don't know, $20 or $30 billion and offer stipends of $20,000 or $25,000 a year so that people can have some of their living costs paid and get those degrees within 2 or 3 years rather than 5 or 6 years. And remember, 2/3 of people who enroll don't get a degree at all. Now, that would take people off of the unemployment line. It would improve the productivity of the workforce, but it costs money. And right now, Obama has been swayed by the deficit hawks. He appointed a commission on reducing the deficit before we're even into a serious recovery, as if reducing the deficit were more important than jobs. So he's got to not just rise to the occasion as a leader and take on the Republicans, but he's got to offer more robust policies if the same voters who voted for Scott Brown when the midterm election comes up in November 2010 don't come to the same conclusions that they did when they voted for Brown, namely, yeah, this guy seemed promising, but what's he delivered? Obama has to deliver more. Obama's first year was a learning experience, to put it charitably. To put it uncharitably, he floundered around. The initial stimulus program was not big enough. His own staff wanted a bigger program. He dithered for months and months and months trying to find a bipartisan compromise that was never in the cards on health care. I think the mortgage relief program was far too feeble. And, you know, if you look at all of the various financial issues that are baffling to ordinary people, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, that's inside baseball. But whether my neighbor had their house repossessed by the bank, or whether I get some relief on a subprime loan that I was tricked into taking out, that's not technical inside baseball. That's my livelihood. And that could have been and should still be a really winning issue for this president. So far, he hasn't done well enough on that. But I think where I would give him a higher grade, if you will, is on the learning curve. It finally sunk in that there is no common ground with Republicans. It finally sunk in that people respect leadership. And you could see the Democrats at the signing ceremony. It's like, wow, hey, we won. We're not wusses. And that tastes good. And so you need a lot more of that. Now, I think many of us who were excited by Obama during the campaign saw that potential in him and were very disheartened during the first year when he didn't rise to the occasion, didn't live up to that potential. Now we're getting kind of excited again. And healthcare is almost a one-off in the sense that what afflicts most people in the economy is not an absence of healthcare. 85% of people have insurance. The bill only helps 2/3 of the 15% who don't have insurance. You don't get reelected on that. You don't increase your troops in Congress based on that. It's jobs, it's housing, it's public services falling apart. The jury is still very much out on whether he's going to rise to the occasion on these other areas that determine how regular people feel about him and determine whether the economy recovers. Some of the right-wing opposition to Obama is unmistakably racist, and a lot of it is in code. So, for example, when the right wing talks about subsidizing people who don't deserve to have their health insurance paid for, you know, it's a wink and a nod. We're talking about black people and immigrants. When the right wing talks about deadbeat mortgage holders, they're talking about minorities. In fact, the whole Tea Party movement, you may recall, started out with a reporter for, I think it was CNBC, on the floor of a Chicago trading firm, screaming about the injustice of people who didn't deserve mortgage relief getting mortgage relief. And he said we ought to have a Tea Party. So, you know, there's a lot of resentment. Some of it's racial, and I don't think it's reasonable to say that all of the backlash against Obama is simply racist, because I think that lets Obama off the hook. If he were delivering more, there would be less fuel and there would be less anxiety among white working class people. He's starting to move in the right direction. That's the good sign. We have to help him. It's always tricky when you have progressives who supported a progressive president and he doesn't live up to expectations. And I've said many times, we need tough love for Barack Obama. We need to push him and prod him and help him become the president who we hoped he could be.